Welcome everybody to this great initiative by the Royal Economic Society. So this is a panel with a fantastic number of experts. So the broad title that we gave this panel is "What is a forecast and how useful are they, particularly right now?" So we thought we would give our speakers some time to present their specific topics, and then we'll open the discussion and also we'll answer your questions if they arrive. So I will first introduce our first speaker, which is Robert Choate. So Robert is, as I understand, about to step down from his second term as the chairman of the Office for Budget Responsibility. And previously he was a director of the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and he was an advisor at the IMF. And before that, he was an economics editor for the Financial Times. So I think it would be very interesting to hear his sort of institutional perspective on our question. So I'll hand the field to Robert.
Thank you very much indeed, Raffaella. It's a great pleasure to participate in this event, although daunting to be in such technically sophisticated company. My professional engagement with economic and fiscal forecasting was first as a consumer and then a producer. I spent a decade happily mocking other people's efforts as a journalist. Since when I've spent 2 decades helping colleagues to construct forecasts and then trying to explain them to the public. Given that experience, my main observation today is that the approach you take to forecasting has to reflect the use that you're going to put it to. You have to construct the forecast and explain it in a way that's fit for that purpose. Now, the OBR as a fiscal watchdog wasn't created to engage in an intellectual spot the ball competition for real GDP or even the budget deficit, but rather to, quote, examine and report on the sustainability of the public finances, unquote, or as my former Australian counterpart pithily put it, to keep the bastards honest, and also to satisfy some specific requirements that are set out in legislation. So we're told in law a list of variables that we have to forecast and the time period over which we have to do so. Specifically, we're required to produce 2 5-year forecasts each year to accompany the Chancellor of the Exchequer's budget and his spring fiscal statements. And we do this for 5 main purposes. First, as an input into the policymaking process. So in the run-up to each fiscal event, we provide the Treasury with 3 iterations of an unpublished pre-measures forecast for the public finances that we then close down a couple of weeks beforehand to provide them with a stable basis on which to take policy decisions. In tandem, we examine the measures that the Chancellor is considering, assessing their potential impact and their fiscal cost or yield. Second, we publish a detailed post-measures forecast to give Parliament and the public as full and transparent an assessment of the outlook for the public finances as we can, spelling out the impact not only of the individual policy measures taken, but also the indirect effects of the package as a whole via its feedback effects on the economy. Third, we're required to judge whether the government has a better than 50% chance of hitting whatever fiscal rules it has set itself on its current policy settings. We're also required to discuss the risks around our forecasts and around that assessment, so we accompany our central view with various illustrations of the uncertainty around it. Fourth, our forecasts provide a baseline against which to judge the significance of incoming news on the economy and the public finances. To that end, for example, HMRC, the tax authority, converts our annual forecasts for individual tax receipts into monthly profiles so they can compare them to the flow of outturned data. And fifth, least visibly, but still I think very importantly, we offer detailed scrutiny and challenge to the experts in the tax department, the Department for Work and Pensions, the Debt Management Office and various other departments as regards their modelling of individual revenue and spending lines and their analysis of particular policy measures. And this is especially important now that the government publishes no forecasts of its own and therefore has less incentive to provide that scrutiny and challenge itself. Now, in pursuing all of these objectives, the rationale for getting us to do the job rather than the Treasury is obviously to reassure people that the forecast is based on professional judgment rather than politically motivated wishful thinking, and also to blow the whistle if the government moves its fiscal target goalposts. So how do those objectives and that rationale shape our approach to the task? Well, first, they require us to produce a forecast that's conditioned on current government policy, even if we and everyone else expect that policy to change. That, of course, makes it hard to benchmark our performance against counterparts who are producing unconditional forecasts. Second, they require a highly disaggregated bottom-up approach to the fiscal forecast, focusing not just on the economic drivers of individual lines, but on administration, deliverability, history of past liabilities, etc. It would not be good enough for us simply to come up with a couple of top-down equations that do a pretty good job of explaining spending or receipts in aggregate, although those could be valuable as a supplementary sense check. Third, they require detailed discussion of the individual forecast lines and clear diagnostics to explain changes from one forecast to the next, precisely to reassure people that those changes aren't politically motivated or tainted. Again, for us, this is not just a spot the ball competition. The forecast is as much about delivering transparency and accountability as about demonstrating predictive prowess. Fourth, the forecast numbers really have to be accompanied by a comprehensible narrative of what is going on in the economy and the public finances and what impact policy will have. Parliament and the public needs to be able to engage with the forecast. We couldn't justify our predictions simply with an appeal to a statistical black box, and the Chancellor certainly couldn't justify significant policy decisions that way. Fifth, our economic forecast is designed primarily to help generate our fiscal forecast. So unlike most macro commentators, we are more interested in the components of nominal spending and incomes than we are in real GDP. And we're more interested in the medium term than in the short term, because in-year fiscal forecasts are driven more by year-to-date fiscal outturns than by near-term macro developments. Sixth, like most public finance forecasters, our macro models are quite old-fashioned compared to those favoured by central banks and academics, more Naomi Campbell and Bella Hadid. We do some scenario analysis, but our main job is to produce a central forecast conditioned on current policy, rather than simulating alternative policy paths to choose between. We also publish a lot of variables for transparency and accountability. So as a result, we still use a large-scale macroeconometric model rather than the DSGE models that central banks typically prefer for their size and theoretical underpinnings. Seventh, the economic judgment calls that have mattered most for fiscal forecasts in recent years have been just that, judgment calls, rather than features of the structural models used or the fruits of sophisticated curve fitting. These relate to the likely path of trend productivity growth and potential output. Having risen 2 to 3% a year for decades, accompanied by mostly short-lived fluctuations, productivity, as we all know, has dramatically underperformed from around the time of the financial crisis. Rather than simply assuming that output would in time return to its previous path, the Treasury made the immediate and consequential judgment in its first mid-crisis forecast that the future path of potential GDP would be 4% lower and the structural budget deficit consequently higher. But they also assumed that the growth of trend TFP and potential GDP over the medium and long term will be unaffected, and that's a judgment that we in turn have had to revisit repeatedly, and not that scientifically, as that period of underperformance has continued and as temporary crisis-related explanations have become less plausible. So let me say briefly how the coronavirus outbreak has required us to modify this, business as usual approach to forecasting. The economic lockdown came hard on the heels of our March forecast, and since then fiscal policy has been modified every few weeks rather than awaiting the autumn budget. So that's required us to provide more of a running commentary with a regularly updated scorecard of policy costings, published monthly profiles, and rejigged monthly commentaries on the outturn data. On Tuesday, we accompanied the long-term projections and risk analysis that we usually publish at this time of the year with 3 new medium-term public finance scenarios based on different paths for the economy. And that reflects the fact that the outlook will depend on the course of the pandemic, the development of effective vaccines and treatments, the evolution of public health restrictions, and the response of individuals and businesses as all these things unfold, all of which means, I think, we couldn't claim to produce a meaningful central forecast. Given limited time, I focused on our medium-term forecasts rather than long-term projections, but these too need to be fit for purpose, to highlight factors like demographics, healthcare cost pressures, the design of pension and student loan systems. They're necessarily more stylized, they require broad brush interpretations of what current policy means, and they usually assume away the economic cycle. Their value lies much more in how they change over time and what they imply for sustainability in broad terms, rather than focusing on the precise level of the debt to GDP ratio in 50 years' time that's implied by an explosive path that we know policymakers couldn't remain on for long. So, as I say, the overall message is this is horses for courses. The way you do the forecast, the way you present it, depends on what you're trying to achieve with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert, also for keeping the time. It was very thought-provoking. We pass on the virtual floor to Gary Young. So Gary is Deputy Director of the NISR, the National Institute for Economic and Social Research. He was previously at the Bank of England, where he was directly involved in monetary policy and financial stability. And Gary will talk about forecasting in a crisis. Here's to you, Gary.
Thank you, Raffaella. I will just share my screen. Okay. Okay, so as everyone knows, the outlook is very precarious at the moment. And this chart shows on the left the fan chart we produced in our latest forecast in May, and compares it with the fan chart on the right that we produced in our forecast in February. The risks have increased enormously. This is the forecast for UK GDP growth. So the question with all those risks is, why do you bother to have a forecast at all? Obviously, unconditional prediction is prone to forecast error, as the current situation proves. But I think there's also a very strong demand for forecast analysis from various policymakers, but from the general public as well, as a tool for thinking about different possible futures, for assessing the risks, tracking progress, and as a basis for recommending policy changes as new information arrives. So economic forecast should be sort of conducted in the way that Robert described: a clear narrative, wide-ranging assessment of risk and different policies, supported by a rigorous model which has a strong governance structure underlying it. So what I think is that the forecasts are really a guide to action today. So this is a quote from Martin Wheel from the 90s. He said the main function of NISR macro forecast was to provide a structure for the assessment of the current economic situation. So in a sense, they're not so much about the future as about what action you need to take today to make the future better. Even the best forecasts will be wrong, and sometimes bad forecasts will be right. The key question is whether they lead to better decisions and policy or not. Now, at the National Institute, we use a global macroeconomic model, which we call NIGEM, which has different individual country models for about 45 individual countries. And they have a lot of the features that you find in the modern macroeconomics textbook: sticky prices, forward-looking consumption and investment, monetary policy feedback rules, and long-run fiscal solvency would be imposed. As I say, it's a multi-country model, and the individual countries are related to each other by trade relationships and asset pricing relationships. And the models are fitted around the standard international national accounting framework. One of the features of the model is that the supply side drives output in the medium term, but in the short term, demand factors are important. So this is sort of fairly standard Keynesian type approach to modeling. We use the model to produce forecasts, and this is the summary of the forecast that we produced in May, which, as you will see, has obviously had a very sharp dip in GDP growth in 2020 and a recovery in 2021. Now, there are obviously substantial risks around this, and so we see this as a plausible scenario rather than a confident prediction. It was conditioned on a gradual easing of the lockdown from the middle of May, which happened with no significant recurrence of the virus. But there are very large, mainly downside risks to this forecast, as I showed earlier. This chart shows, gives you some idea of the downside nature of the risk, where we take the central projection, which has got it in the dotted line. This is for global GDP, and think about what the risks are of different recurrences of the virus in 2021, with a probability that we set at something like 25% in each country. So that, you know, the probability is the virus could recur in different countries, and they would have to be lockdown with correspondingly sharp reductions in output in those cases. So when you do that, what you observe is that the central case, as we might describe it, is very unlikely if you believe that the likelihood of a recurrence is as high as I put it. And this is a useful sort of thing that you can do with a model-based forecast, is you can carry out these sorts of analysis. Now the question is, how do you actually produce a forecast? It's something which is so unprecedented as the COVID-19 shock. Well, the way we go about it, and I'm sure others go about it in the same way, is think about the channels by which a shock affects the economy. And I've listed here some of them in terms of the productivity and hours of work, just general lower activity due to lockdowns, the fact that spending on consumption and investment is likely to be lower. There's lower demand and supply from other countries, and there'll be lower risk appetite, which could affect the cost of capital. And all those different channels interact with each other and to some extent counteract each other. So, you know, if the economy is in lockdown, it really doesn't matter too much what's happening to desired consumption, because people can't realize that spending anyway. So that's the sort of central forecast, the risks around it. We also wanted to talk about scenario analysis, and how you can use scenarios to assess policy. Now, one example of a scenario analysis which would be very interesting to see is the Chancellor's analysis of the effect of ending the coronavirus job retention scheme. This is due to end this is now going to end at the end of October. And he confirmed that in his summer statement last week. So the question would be, what's the implication for unemployment and living standards of being with the retention scheme or being without it? And what's the implication for government borrowing with the scheme and without it? Does the policy change make sense in the light of that analysis? Now, our analysis was that unemployment would rise quite sharply without the coronavirus job retention scheme in place. And in our last forecast, we had unemployment rising to above 10%, and I saw that the OBR forecast scenarios were even higher than that, and Robert presented them the other day. So, you know, this is, you know, ending the scheme is going to have a big effect on unemployment. You could have kept the scheme going, and by the end of the year, there probably wouldn't be as many people on the furlough scheme as there were back in April and May. So the cost of retaining the scheme at the end of the year would probably be something less than £5 billion a month. And so, you know, in terms of the overall spending of the scheme, you could have kept it going for another 6 months with a cost of about 30 billion, which is relatively, obviously it's a lot of money, but it's relatively small beer compared to what has been spent so far. So what are the risks of announcing that you're going to end a scheme, as a Chancellor did last week? Then you could think of these as, you know, he's made it clear to people that the scheme won't continue, and for many employers, they may think, well, we may as well get rid of staff now because we can't see any uptick in activity before October, and the cost of the scheme is likely to rise, and we've got to contribute more to the scheme over the coming months. It would also affect the spending decisions of those furloughed workers who are on the scheme, uncertain about their future. On top of that, those are sort of early effects of ending the scheme. There'll be a surge in unemployment after the end of October cliff edge. Workers could use their connection to business and firm-specific human capital as a result. And as a consequence, there could be a rise in long-term unemployment, which in the past has been associated with higher equilibrium unemployment. And it could end up being more costly to end a scheme than to keep it open. An example of that is in this simulation in the model, which we've done here, just to say, what if productivity turned out to be lower by 1% and the NAIRU 1 percentage point higher as a consequence of premature withdrawal of the fiscal support? Well, what the model simulation suggests is that GDP in the longer term will be 2.5% lower than it would be otherwise. And as a consequence of that, and the tax base being smaller, you would need a higher effective tax rate to keep the debt to GDP ratio unchanged. So I think that's a sort of scenario analysis I would have liked to have seen from the Chancellor, so we could assess properly whether his decision to end the scheme was a good one or not. So with that, I shall now hand back to Rafaela.
Thank you very much, Gary. It was very interesting and concise. presentation. So we're going to move on to Jenny Castle. So Jenny is a fellow of economics in Magdalene College, Oxford, and she's also a member of the Climate Econometrics and Nuffield College. And today she's going to talk about something very topical and in the interest of everybody, which is forecasting COVID-19.
Thank you very much, Rafaela. I'll just share my screen. Okay, I hope everyone can see that. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this webinar on forecasting for the COVID-19 Hub. I'm going to talk the forecast that Jürgen Dornick, David Hendry and I have been producing for the last 4 months, where we've been publishing forecasts of confirmed cases and deaths of COVID-19 pandemic for many parts of the world. So let us leap straight in and look at the data. We started collecting the data on the 15th of March and commenced forecasting the next day. Here I have a plot of confirmed cases and deaths for the UK, US, EU and Italy. The UK and the US are negligible at the moment, but as we go 1 week ahead, we get more rapid growth. The UK went into lockdown on the 23rd of March, the last observation in this graph, but as we move forward, the UK cases and deaths start to increase rapidly. Notice how different the trajectories are. There's no common pattern for how countries evolve through the pandemic, and that's going to be an important aspect of our forecasting methodology. As we extend the graph to the data to where we are now, it highlights some important data issues. Revisions to the data can occur, including changing definitions. We can see negative daily deaths in the data. Of course, there can't be negative deaths, but these are revisions to early accounts. As macroeconomists, we're used to data revisions, but here we are as given, but our methods need to adapt quickly to changes in the reporting basis. We also see some possible seasonality in the data, and this was not expected at the outset. And now we also model the seasonality, which further improves the forecasts. The availability and accuracy of the data is absolutely crucial. We really need high quality data collection and dissemination, and that is perhaps one of the lessons from the early stages of the pandemic. Now, our forecasts are not based on epidemiological models. Epidemiological models, like structural models in economics, have sound theoretical basis and many useful applications. Structural models are invaluable to understanding what is going on, but at the same time, there's a history of simple database devices out forecasting those structural models, not just in economics, but in many different disciplines. One of the reasons for these forecast results is that there are shifts in the distribution of the data that lead to systematically poor forecasts. This model tends to have a built-in equilibrium to which they revert, but if the data has shifted, the forecast will try to return to the wrong equilibrium. Pandemic data are highly non-stationary, as we've just seen. Added to that, the methodologies used for reporting the pandemic data are also non-stationary. We have stochastic trends, such as the ramping up of testing, and distributional shifts, such as the sudden inclusion of care home cases. Our forecasting methods need to adapt rapidly, relying purely on the recent past data, capturing how it has evolved and shifted to predict what will happen next. So I'll show you some of our forecasts. This is a graph of UK confirmed cases up to April in the solid grey line. This is a period when the pandemic was really taking hold in Europe. Countries were seeing exponential growth in cases and deaths, and important policy decisions needed to be made. We decompose this data into a flexible trend given in the dotted blue line and a remainder, and we then produce forecasts starting from the last observation on the 15th of April. And we also forecast from the previous three observations, which are highlighted in grey. We forecast both the trend and the remainder, and the red line is our forecast using the most recent data released. In sample, we can build very flexible models and control overfitting, but too much flexibility is problematic for forecasting as the deterministic terms dominate, so our methods dampen these while still allowing for exponential behaviour. We also give an average forecast from the last 4 data points. This average forecast is the black line adjusted to match the last known observation. There are big differences between the black line and the red lines, and that enables us to monitor changes. For example, if policy is starting to be effective, we should see the red line deviate below the black line. We can then overlay the actual data, given in pink here, and you can see that confirmed cases start to slow down relative to the forecasts about 5 days out. Now, one important aspect of our forecasting methods is robustness to breaks. Here we have deaths for Italy back in early March, when Italy was one of the first European countries to have been hit hard by the pandemic. You can see a break in trend on the 7th of March, which our forecasts miss, which is not surprising, but our methods need to recover rapidly from these mistakes. If we move forward just one day, we can see that the forecasts have updated and are now following the trajectory of the data, which of course was unknown at the time as these were real-time forecasts. The average forecast in black using the last 4 observations as starting points trails behind, as we would expect given the shift. Another aspect that we've recently added is disaggregated forecasts by local authority level. The data were only made available since the 2nd of July, and Jürgen has generated these heat maps to show our 1 week ahead forecasts for cases. This will help policymakers as we move into a new phase of the pandemic, characterized by local lockdowns in response to local flare-ups. Such disaggregated forecasts provide invaluable early information to keep national levels in check. Now, our short-term forecasts work well in the exponential phase of the pandemic, delivering substantially smaller forecast errors than some epidemiological models. But as we move past the peak, which we have methods for dating, we can improve on these extrapolative forecasts by using past outcomes, which we call scenarios, to generate forecasts. When we started, the only scenario that we had experience of was for China. And the red line here shows what happened to confirmed cases and deaths in China after heavy smoothing. You can see the jump in confirmed cases on the 12th of February. This was due to reclassifying asymptomatic cases. And we then stretched the data. The evolution of the Chinese epidemic occurred on quite a tight time scale, which may not be replicated in other countries. So we stretched to obtain different scenario evolutions. And the last path in green evolves at half the speed. We take all these different scenarios at different points in time and saturate our model with them, selecting the relevant scenarios using a machine learning algorithm. And we end up with a model where we can use the future path of the selected scenario to forecast the evolution of the pandemic. So in a sense, we have out of sample information on the scenario. This graph applies our path saturation method to UK deaths on the 25th of June with the scenario forecast for the following week given. And if we overlay the actual UK deaths in light blue, which were unknown at the time we produced the forecast, you can see that the scenario forecast is very accurate. But why does it work? Well, we line up the data once the peak is identified, shifting by time, and then we standardize the data by the size of the peak. The black lines show the average across 8 European countries after standardization. And then in the light green, you can see the same for the scenarios from Chinese confirmed cases, and in the blue, the scenarios from Chinese deaths. And now you can see why these scenarios are useful for forecasting. To the right of the peak, we don't know the black lines, but we do have the full evolution of the scenarios in green and blue. And we can use these to predict cases and deaths for countries once a peak is identified. We're still developing the approach. By now, we can start to use scenarios from other countries, for example, to distinguish scenarios between countries that exhibit more of a plateau behavior rather than peak behavior. And the forecast performance in terms of mean absolute errors seems to be better than our short-term forecasts at longer horizons. So to conclude, forecasts are invaluable to help inform decision-making and planning, to help identify second peaks or local flare-ups, and to see if policies have had an impact on confirmed cases and deaths. We provide forecasts that are complementary to epidemiological models. They're timely, produced in real time, open to inspection, and robust to data issues. The forecasts are updated almost daily on our website, and we look forward to the time when we no longer need to produce these forecasts. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Indeed, we're all looking forward to not talking about COVID-19 forecasting, but here we are. So our next speaker is Hashem Pesaran. So Hashem, for most of us, needs no introduction, and it's impossible to summarize his 38-page long CV. He's is successfully straddled the high levels of academia, both in the UK and in the US. He was professor at Cambridge, at USC. I see now he's at San Diego. I wasn't aware of that. And he's been everywhere and he's made very important contribution, recognized widely. He's a fellow of the Econometric Society of the British Academy. And today he's going to talk about something new. And I'm really looking forward to hear him talk about counterfactual analysis. Yes, to you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for a kind introduction. I haven't really moved to San Diego. I think that's an error. I'm still at University of Southern California, and I'm speaking to you from Los Angeles. And thanks so much for holding the seminar a bit later so that we can accommodate my timing. Let me see whether I can share the screen. I presume you see the screen. And this is the work I'm going to present in two parts. One is basically some methodological issues which arises when you have a problem like now, a sort of a shock which has never happened before, not only in terms of its intensity, but in terms of its pervasiveness globally. And then I'm going to use some version of the global model we have been developing in the past with a number of colleagues, Alec Chudik, Kamyar Mohandes, and Mehdi Reisi from IMF, and Alessandro Rebucci from Johns Hopkins, to give you some results we have, which we are in process of writing up. Since the time is short, so I'm going to start very quickly giving my point of view to the title of the talk. Basically, I don't understand scenario forecast by itself because people use scenario forecasts in a very informal manner. I'm not suggesting the previous speakers did so. The previous speakers were very careful to say their scenarios are based on a model. But people use scenario forecasting in a very loose manner, which I think that could be problematic because it's very difficult to basically find out what is the assumptions and whether those assumptions and the model which underlies can be validated. So I'm, as we probably guess, I'm more interested in formal models. But on the other hand, I understand that formal models cannot always capture events which have not occurred or events which have occurred but very rarely. And that's what I've been thinking about, and I'm going to share with you some of the ideas here. Now, the method I use is what I've developed with other colleagues called generalized impulse response function. It is a method. It is a method that I think is universally applicable, whether your model is large, small, linear, nonlinear, and whether you're interested in the effect of the shocks on the mean distribution, median, or some interquartile range of the process. In other words, dealing with uncertainty of the shock. So this is what I'm going to talk about and show you what are the differences are when you have a big shock as compared to normal or maybe usual shocks, let's call them. Now, when the shocks are not too large, which is what let's call it normal type of shocks, which happens, some bigger than others, but nevertheless, we have a lot of data on them and they recur. I believe log linear approximation that people have been using, like vector regressive models or DSGE or whatever, or even large models, all of them are really could be a good approximation for a different purpose. Of course, depending on the purpose of the model, the nature of the model would be different. It could be large or small, depending what is the aim. So I'm not really religious about what should be the model size, whether it should be DSGE or should be large New Keynesian macro model. It depends on the purpose. And the main problem is whether you can identify the shocks, and that is where a priori reasoning coming, and I don't want to get into that. I think we economists spend too much time on this problem, which I don't think there is a clear answer. And anyway, if there is an answer, isn't clear to one person, it's not clear to others. So let's just look at the linear models first, which most people use. Now, the problem with linear model is that while it's very useful, the effect of the shock on the outcome is proportional. That is why the size of the shock is not that important in this kind of analysis, because one standard error shock people use could be multiplied by any number, get any number you want, because everything is proportional. The second issue with linear models is that they are history or state independent. Basically means it doesn't matter whether you shock the economy in the recession or in the expansion phase, the outcome again is the same. The third is that the model that is used to develop the shock scenario often is assumed to be invariant to the shock. I'm not talking about Lucas critique, I'm talking about the relationship of the economy. So say the shock is so small that the relation of the economy does not change. Now, we know, unfortunately, none of the above three properties hold when you have large shocks. So this is what I addressed with Simon Potter and Gary Poop in a paper which has been, become more into the, if you like, literature nowadays, as people look at this problem, dealing with many shocks in the economy or a high dimensional system, which is very difficult to use a prior reasoning to identify shocks. So as soon as you go to a nonlinear model, there are three features we talk about will not hold. The shock, the effect of it is not proportional. So therefore you could have a very small shock, it could have a large effect and so on. Some people call it butterfly effects. Now, the other thing is the state of the economy. We say it's not good to hit a man who is down. It's the same here. If the state of the economy is a negative state and suddenly you get a shock, is not the same as the state of the economy in the upward phase and you hit a shock when your system is nonlinear. The third property, obviously, is that the effect of the shock could be much more persistent, could have maybe not permanent, but could look permanent for quite a long time. So it doesn't go away. A lot of people think everything is like a switching a light. When you have a nonlinear system, it's not like switching a light on and off. Things don't go back. There is no V-shaped effect. The curve could be quite complicated. So we need to address this issue. So we need basically to allow for nonlinearity. We need to worry about what is the size of the shock. So what is the COVID shock? What is the size of the COVID shock? We all talk about it. Very difficult to know what it is in magnitude. And also common shocks become very important because when you have a shock which affects all the economies, looking at a single economy is a mistake. There's a number of papers in US and the UK which they look at the single economy. They open the economy. It doesn't really help because you really need to show how the global shock pervasively affects everybody. Like the example of Sweden, we're going to talk at this time, is quite a clear case. Sweden, they follow a different approach to dealing with COVID shock inside the economy, but they were affected by international environment around them, Norway, Denmark, and and other countries around because they were trading with them. Obviously, they are not going to be immune to the shock, even if they follow a different policy. You cannot swim against the tide. Now, so what about the COVID itself? I've got a few minutes. I don't have time to go over all the detail. I'll show you some results we have. Obviously, people have already mentioned these points that COVID is not one shock. It's a combination of the supply side, there's a demand side, there's uncertainty. So we all know about that. And I think the question is, how do you size the shock? The way previous speaker talked about those who address this, they said we look at different aspects of the economy, but still you don't know what the effect of COVID shock is on different aspects of the economy. So there is an aggregation problem, but there is also individual issue as the uncertainty of the size of the shock on different parts of the economy, because it depends on how human beings behave and how do they deal with the uncertainty which they're facing. So the way we approach in a counterfactual is basically saying, okay, let's look at the economy, which is we have been observing up to time t, but suddenly you get this new shock, which I've never observed before, at time t+1, which could have effect t+2. So then you could define the effect of the shock very simply by just looking at, if you could figure out what would be the economy when the shock hits, I'm coming to that, it's easy. You need to compare it with what the state of the economy was before. If the system is nonlinear, this is the state of the economy. As you go forward to go multiple horizon, then become more and more complicated, and nonlinearity would kick in. Now, the point of this is that you need still an economy to create X. The way we try to do it is basically to say, okay, where do we find the effect of the size of the shock? So what we do, we actually go and look at IMF. So we say, let's look at a guess estimate of the size of the COVID shock. But we do it across many countries because our model is global and the shocks is common. And that has to be taken into account. So we looked at the IMF prediction of the world economy, country by country, in early January, which was basically before the COVID shock, really. I mean, the calculation was done based on a model ending 2019. Then we looked at the revision they made to the prediction in April of 2020. Now, by April, it was become clear that obviously the China also started, the previous speakers showed that the virus started picking up in middle of March in Europe, and people became aware of it. So IMF revised their prediction downward. So what we do, we use this revision as a way of size shock on output. But the IMF doesn't have any revision on equity market, on long-term interest rate, on oil prices, on all the other variables in a coherent way. So what we did, we then used our model in order to find out if the condition on IMF revisions, what sort of other revision the economy would have to encounter given the consistency of the model in the past. But that's okay, because the past model is valid for this connection. It is the future which we don't know. So then we use also realized volatility to capture the uncertainty to deal with the nonlinearity aspects of it. Since the time is short, I just want to show you some of the results we have. I mean, we have 33 countries. It's similar to NIGEM, I guess, but it's different in terms of structure, but it covers quite a large number of countries. And if you look at it, you find what we find that the effect of the COVID, these are not prediction, because this is the effect of the shock relative to what would have been expected. Now, if people expected the economy to go up 3%, the effect of COVID shock would be greater. But if you look at it, it's about 5%, but it also suggests that it's not going to go away that easily. Even if that is the quarter 4 of 2021. In advanced economies are even slightly worse. As you would expect, the sub-Asian economies are doing a little bit better, although the margin of uncertainty is quite high. And then if you basically look at the individual countries, the only country which at the moment looks like could come out okay is China, although it's too early to say, because there may be another recurrence of the outbreak of the virus there as well. And the UK is not doing that well. We believe it would be 10% below par, and the US would fare a little bit better. Euro is more like a US. So basically, I just want to stop here. We have other slides we can talk about. Another example would be the Swedish one, which we can talk about, but I'm going to stop now.
Thank you very much, Hashem. That's great. So I think we can all now show our videos and have a true sort of real life panel set up. It will be great. And we've had a couple of questions, and I wanted to, first of all, there was a question about also the topic, the title of our talk, which is the difference between a scenario and a forecast. And I think I wanted to give Jenny the opportunity perhaps to answer to Hashem's provocative take on the usefulness of scenarios. So first of all, if you could just really say the way you really view us, how you define a scenario and why you think it's useful, particularly now.
Okay, so the way we use the scenarios for our forecasts, we have a method for producing quite short-term forecasts, but we wanted to try and produce forecasts that could extend further than just the short-term forecast. And to do that, we needed some information on how the pandemic might evolve over time. And of course, the only example that we have of that for the current COVID-19 is the fact that China's actually been through and seen a full cycle. Of course, there may well be second peaks, etc., but we've seen a full cycle within China, and so we can use that example to see if other countries actually evolve in a very similar way or not. Now, it turns out that actually different countries have very different experiences of how the pandemic evolves over time. But despite that, we have managed to find, with lots of smoothing, that actually after the peak, reductions do seem to follow a fairly similar pattern for many countries. We do see some countries, particularly in Latin America, showing more sort of plateau type behavior rather than peak behavior. We see additional exponential growth, for example, in the US, where we thought we identified a peak, and of course that soon disappeared. So we do need more scenarios of these different countries' experiences in order to get more accurate forecasts depending on each country's dynamics. But we certainly do seem to find that the Chinese experience does help us to try and produce more medium-term forecasts for countries that have passed the peak.
Danny. I wanted to see if Robert and Gary could say something about the way that forecasting scenarios are used in policy institutions in practice, if there's a difference or there's a privilege of one of the two.
But shall I start? I'm sure from a technical perspective, we fall into Hashem's issue of loose language in terms of the distinction you make between this. I think from our point of view, it depends in part on the sort of set of conditioning assumptions that you're putting into the analysis that you're doing. I mean, even our forecasts are not unconditional forecasts. As I say, we are required to assess the implications of current government policy, and therefore it's conditioned on that basis. When you think about the three scenarios that we've just produced earlier this week, the sense of that was, as I say, that the normally worrying about sort of the economic background and the nature of fiscal policy differences. Clearly, the outlook depends on health, public health policy, the progress of the pandemic, whether you get a good vaccine or treatments relatively early. So what we did was basically to think about three ways in which the economy could evolve that might be consistent with those differences in those sorts of assumptions. Our Irish counterparts actually produced three scenarios very much built on a set of stories about the epidemiology, about the process of the disease, would you have second waves, etc. We've essentially said, look, our first scenario is assuming a V shape with no long-term scarring. The central scenario and the worst, not worst case, the downside scenario have scarring of 3 and 6% of GDP at the end of the 5-year period, and more or less rapid recovery. So you might think of those as being consistent with, rapid progress and good news on the epidemiological front, or in the more extreme cases, not getting a good vaccine and therefore having behavior, people continuing to be nervous in their consumption and their production behavior throughout. So, they're not as precisely linked together as some people would make the effort, but we think it tells a consistent story about the different factors other than fiscal policy choices that might give you very different outcomes for public sector debt.
Thank you. So that you're mentioning a V-shape also links to a question by Anna Galvao. She was asking about, given the fact that no past recessions in the UK was truly V-shaped, how can one support a V-shaped forecast based on models and data? And I wonder if Gary could answer to that, given that it was also a more general question about the usefulness of models right now and the judgmental assumptions embedded in them.
Well, I think the V-shaped recovery was a sort of plausible scenario, but I think it isn't the only one. And I think the evidence since over the last 3 months, in many ways, has been quite good and sort of favourable towards that, in the sense that in the UK, the virus has become less prevalent than it was, which is a good thing. That wasn't obvious that was going to happen a while ago. The GDP fall in the second quarter wasn't as bad as some people thought it would be, and so generally the V-shape wasn't a crazy scenario, but it was one of many. And I think there are I would say that there isn't much that's better than a V-shaped, and there's quite a lot that's worse. I think on average, you are more likely to get something a bit weaker than that. In terms of scenarios, I think generally we have a lot of freedom as an independent research institute that Robert doesn't have. We can try out different assumptions about government policy. For example, a year or two ago, we thought that the assumption that the government would stick to its fiscal plans was unlikely to be true, and so we started to relax that assumption and look at how fiscal policy might be different to what was expected. I think that produced some useful information. Similarly, one of the things we spent a lot of time doing over the last 3 years is analysing Brexit. Another one of these shocks that we haven't really any past experience of. And again, I think the way to do it is you just read the literature, find out what the various channels are, and plug them into your model and see what you get, and then sort of test them out a bit. What difference would it make if you believe this rather than that? And that's how we've sort of approached that.
Yeah. So a running theme and a question that Jagjit and I really wanted all of you to answer was the issue of uncertainty. So I think all of you conveyed in strong terms how much more uncertainty there is right now, not only in terms of models, the data, the assumptions embedded in the data. So what I wanted to ask to Hashem, sort of particularly given his presentation that tries to get a global aggregate perspective, are we trying to be too ambitious about forecasting given the huge uncertainties, and how do we take account of these uncertainties and how do we convey them to the public?
Well, I think it's a very tough problem. I mean, it's just, I think ideally you want to link the epidemic model to the economic model, in my view. And remember, we have another paper which we try to do that basically because the behavior of individual to the disease is come from their uncertainty how to deal with the disease. I mean, you can open the restaurants. Doesn't mean people go to the restaurants, you know, not as much as before. So this is what is the issue. So therefore, how do you balance risk, health risk with economic risk? And I think every individual, in my view, have to do that. And government has to provide a framework so that individual within it can make the correct decisions. It's not each of us alone which could make the decision. Unless there is a collective understanding that how all of us behave, we would never be able to adjust to this particular shock. It's different from other shock. It's different from financial shock, for sure. It has got similar implication like a financial shock, but you become duped to thinking it's like a financial shock. It's not. So therefore, that's why I don't think it would be a sort of a quick switch on and off of the light. I think this analogy is a pretty good one. It's not like switching on and off. So basically, because you open, but people, if there is a risk, unless you get a vaccine, unless there is a remedy, and that takes a long time. I mean, and the other thing is every country knows. I mean, we have also been looking at how do you predict the COVID itself. I think that's important. Is we look at Israel, look at Iran, look at many other countries in Europe. The break is coming out. Israel almost controlled it. Please have a look at Israel. See how you predict it from China. China was a draconian way of dealing with it. You cannot replicate the Chinese experience anywhere else in the world, in my view. And it's impossible. And even you could, it's too late now. Another thing we found that intervention by government, 1 week delay makes a big difference to the height of the curve. And these are then the height of the curve and how you come out of it affects the economic uncertainty. So I don't think it's easy just to follow the old way of doing it. I'm sorry, I have to be honest with you. I spent 4 months just thinking about this problem. And you need to integrate a model of the social behavior and how you deal with the risk of the health and the economy into these models. But unfortunately, by the time we do that, may not be relevant. Maybe there is a vaccine coming, but that's what we need to do. We haven't done it.
So we need quick decisions, sort of what Robert was saying about the need to incorporate real-time data as it comes along and also react quickly. And I wonder if you, Robert, agree, or if there's anything you can say to academics in terms of whether we can provide any useful tools in terms of addressing these issues, particularly the uncertainty, and how to communicate it to policymakers.
Well, I mean, traditionally, we in quote unquote normal times, we've tried to illustrate the uncertainty around our central forecast by fan charts, not subjective probability distributions, but based on the size and direction of past forecast errors. I mean, that's questionable enough under normal circumstances because you have a combination of errors when the economy is performing relatively normal and missed turning points, which are rather sort of combining apples and oranges there. And also using looking at the sensitivity of your forecast to particular variables. So it is useful to be able to tell policymakers, if you're very wrong about variables A, B, C, and D, it actually isn't going to matter very much to the overall picture. But if you're wrong about D and E, then that is going to have more of an impact. But I don't think it's surprising that under the current circumstances, we've ended up having to go back more to the sort of scenario approach. Again, as I say, sort of things that are broadly consistent with different stories about the epidemiology. rather than claiming that we're in a position to say, you know, what is our central forecast of the progress of the pandemic, and then conditioning the economy on that. I think you raised obviously the importance of, and obviously everybody's now terribly excited about the potential for very high frequency real-time information. You know, I'm sure that, you know, let's make the use of that than we can, but a little bit of wariness. I mean, even looking back, the degree, you know, as we look now, how much significance should we put into the fact that the May GDP numbers show a rise of, you know, 1.8% after a decline of 25 over the last 2 months? This is the very, very early drafts of statistical economic history. You know, I can remember, you go back to the 1990s recession in 1993 or 94, the national accounts were showing a 4 and a bit percent peak to trough decline and a double dip. Go back to the national accounts 20 years later, they showed the decline was 2.5% and there was no double dip. So your understanding even of the data many years after the event can change a good deal. So you know, as I say, by all means make all the use of high frequency and new information as you can, but we're going to be rewriting this history for many decades to come.
Thank you. I want to ask Gary briefly, so do you think there's still hope for economic models, and particularly econometric models, for policy making in these times?
I do. I think there should be more. I mean, one of the things that always amuses me is when I watch the weather forecast and you see the sort of sophisticated technology that the weather forecasters have and resources they have for doing that. And yet, you know, economic forecasters don't have resources, anything like that. There's not enough people doing it. It would be great if there were, you know, 200 people here talking about their different scenarios for COVID. But, you know, there's a relatively few of us. We all do things slightly differently because of our own preferences and so on. And it would be good to really have a bigger community and more resources going into this endeavor, I think.
Thank you. And very quickly, we only have 3 minutes and then we're going to be automatically shut off. So apologies if we get cut off. And thank you for all of you and also the speakers. And I wanted to ask Jenny and Hashem in turn, if in 2 minutes they can say what they think is the most exciting area of research in forecasting in these new circumstances.
You want to start with me, or?
Yes.
Well, I think I agree with many points raised by previous speakers. We need more people being involved in modeling. Unfortunately, resources in modeling has diminished, but not in the private sector. If you go to hedge fund, if you go to financial market and an institution, there are a lot of people doing it, but unfortunately not for public domain. And that is what I think it is a pity. Now, in terms of what areas, I agree that the very high frequency data is not going to be the way forward because the decisions are made over quarters rather than over days. High frequency data is good for high frequency traders, not for making public choices. So therefore, I think it's very important to do more of what we're doing, but realize the world is globally interconnected. The shocks are common, non-linearities are there, and the world never repeats itself. But we will see.
I think I would echo that. I think the thing that this has really highlighted is that focusing on non-stationarities is really essential. Non-stationarities in the sense of distributional shifts, shocks, structural breaks, all of these things really need to be embedded in our forecasting models. And previous forecasting models have had a tendency to always assume underlying stationary behavior.
Thank you very much. I think this is a great ending, some hopefulness after all of those COVID dire projections. And I think there's a type of event hopefully bodes well for the future, you know, intercommunication between policymakers, academics, and hopefully we can all put together our expertise and really make a difference. So I want to thank all of you for very exciting presentations and for your discussion. And I want to remind the speakers that the recording will be made available in a few hours, and then also advertise next week a seminar which will be on the local economic impact of COVID-19. So thank you very much, and we'll leave it here.
Thank
Hope
you.
to see you all in person soon.
Bye, everybody.